Active History is pleased to present a recording of Melanie Newton's talk, A Tale of Two Empires, Race and Revolution in the 1860s Caribbean. The talk was delivered on April 22, 2017, as part of the Other 60s, a decade that shaped Canada and the world, a symposium hosted by the Department of History at the University of Toronto.
My original plan for my presentation today was that the two empires would be the Spanish Caribbean and the British Caribbean, talking about Cuba and Puerto Rico and Jamaica and Canada, but I realized this is kind of ridiculous for the amount of time that I have. So if you do want to hear about Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Spain, I'm happy to talk about that later, but I decided that was not really where I was going to go today. And in fact, the two empires that I'm going to talk about today, and I think there's some sympathy for this position in this audience, refers to the divergent paths that are taken within the British Empire between Canada on the one hand and the British Caribbean and India, in fact, on the other. So these are three very different parts of the British Empire, but in the 19th century, there are certain divergences between Canada on one hand and the Caribbean and India on the other that have everything to do with race. And I think Confederation really has to be seen in that broader context. So I think the broader point, I guess, of my paper, and I should say this is an undergraduate lecture that I've kind of beefed up a little bit for this audience, but it's usually a lot longer, so I will be sort of glossing over a lot of details. But to get to the conclusion, which I will say now because I may not get to it if I run out of time, I think in terms of thinking quite seriously about questions as historians and as human beings, in terms of thinking about sort of global citizenship and the place of the global in thinking about Canada, we can't be selective in how we think about these things. That if thinking about what it means to be Canadian, or I think of myself more as a treaty person, but that's a whole other story, in Canada in the present, if that's important in the present, it's also important in the past. And seeing Confederation outside of that global context is extremely problematic. And seen in that broader imperial and global context, the arrival of responsible government to Canada in the same moment that it is in fact taken away from others on the basis of race, makes it clear that what it was in fact part of was the institutionalization of white minority rule in the British Empire. It was a de-democratizing measure. Precisely the opposite, I think, of what it might appear to be if understood within a very sort of local or sort of North American geopolitical context. In terms of the broader politics of the British Empire, it is part of the entrenchment of white minority rule. So the sort of two other events besides Confederation sort of frame the 1860s in terms of sort of highlights in a way of this sort of struggle over responsible government and over the place of race in shaping political power in the British Empire. So the two events that often are mentioned are the 1857 Indian Rebellion and the 1865 Morant Bay Rebellion. So the Indian Rebellion happened in British India, and the Morant Bay Rebellion happened in Jamaica. So I'll just give you a brief synopsis of the events, and then I'll talk to you a bit about the aftermath, and then give you the longer history in terms of how we understand the relationship between Confederation and these other histories. So the Morant Bay Rebellion of 1865 was a rebellion of black small landowners against local colonial authorities. They killed the local sort of white planter official in the courthouse. There was a court case. There was anger over the role of racism in that case, and it turned into this, it was quite a violent rebellion. The courthouse was burned down, and the repression went on for months afterwards. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 involved sepoy members of the Imperial Army in India, and these were Indian soldiers in the army who were angry over the immediate pretext was the concern that white British officers had coated their cartridges in pig fat and cow fat, which was sort of insulting in religious terms to both Hindus and Muslims. That was the immediate catalyst. But the deeper history was over questions of race and inequality. So in both cases, the suppression of these rebellions was quite violent. So just to give you an example, and in fact, troops who had participated in the suppression of the Indian Rebellion actually 8 years later would be in Jamaica doing the same thing. So a number of the same personnel would be involved. And the official statistics from Jamaica were 439 dead, hundreds flogged, 1,000 houses burned. So this was a long cycle of repression. And in the official documents of both of these incidents, the rebels in both India and Jamaica are made to seem almost like fanatics. If you read sort of published accounts by sort of British political officials of the time, the sepoys come across as these sort of caste-obsessed villains who were angry about the elimination of caste and that they were being treated like others of lower caste than themselves, when in fact the real issue, as Indian scholars point out now in the rebellion, was the racism that was increasingly an element of the experience of being in the British Indian military at the time. Similarly, the black rebels in Jamaica are cast often as sort of bloodthirsty natives, quote unquote, and that this was really the realization of imperial fears of a race war, quote unquote. This is about 30 years after the abolition of slavery, and there had been some concern in British imperial circles for some time that naturally, if black people were free, this would lead to race war. I'm going to come back to this in a bit. So they saw this as the realization of that fear, so that the rebels in Jamaica came across as bloodthirsty natives, not as starving small landowners who felt that the promises of emancipation had not been lived up to. So in both cases, the rebellions themselves had been preceded by, certainly in the case of Jamaica, a couple of decades of petitioning the British government about some of the hopes and expectations that people had had of emancipation. And there were these increasingly callous responses that came back. One of the most notorious and one of the last ones was a document called The Queen's Advice, not authored by the Queen, but which basically told Jamaicans that if they were starving and they didn't have access to land and the wages on plantations were poor, well, the problem was that they were lazy and that they would not work on plantations regularly for proper wages. So there's a whole sort of increasingly callous response to people's concerns about the social and economic and political conditions. The aftermath politically in Britain was a sort of very high-profile inquiry and a trial and acquittal of the governor of Jamaica, a fellow by the name of John Edward Eyre, who had ordered and oversaw the repression. And major figures in British political and intellectual life lined up on either side, either the pro-Eyre or the anti-Eyre camp. So in favor of Eyre, you had Charles Dickens and Thomas Carlyle, and against him, the major figure was the liberal thinker John Stuart Mill. Edward Eyre's legal costs were paid for by the imperial government, and he retired from public life and died of old age. In 1858, a year after the Indian Rebellion, the East India Company, which was the body that had ruled India since the 18th century, was abolished and replaced by the British Raj, or the British Empire in India, so that now you had rule directly by the Crown from London, from Whitehall, from the Colonial Office. Similarly, the aftermath of the Jamaican Morant Bay Rebellion was the abolition of Jamaica's House of Assembly by the House of Assembly itself, followed by all of the houses of assembly of the British Caribbean except for three, which are easy to remember. There are the three Bs, Barbados, Bermuda, and the Bahamas, but that's not the reason why it was just these three. The real issue was that these were the three colonies in the British Caribbean where white minority rule and control of the House of Assembly had not been imperiled by emancipation. Everywhere else, where emancipation had led to a transformation in the size and color of the electorate, those assemblies voted, at the insistence of the imperial government, to abolish themselves. So the longer background here takes us back to the 17th century and early colonization of the Caribbean, and something which came to be called in the 19th century the old representative system, which is the most fond term for it. The less fond term was old corruption, right? So this is a system of government in the British Atlantic world. So we'll look at the background in the Caribbean, and then we'll talk about India. So in the Caribbean, in the 17th century, with colonies like particularly Barbados, Jamaica, St. Kitts, Antigua, some of the oldest colonies in the empire, you have this very early on, the establishment of a system of planter government based on a bicameral legislature loosely modeled on government in Britain. You have the governor, who is sent out from England, representing the monarchy, and then you have a white plantocracy, and this sort of something called the Legislative Council, which advised the governor, and the House of Assembly, which is voted on by a tiny group in the electorate. So these are landowners who met a property franchise, and in many cases, the same families and same people would continue to exercise that degree of political power or monopolize property to that degree until after World War II. So this system is established across the British Caribbean, and only in the late 18th century did the British government begin to imagine possibly replacing this old representative system with something called Crown Colony rule, which was rule directly from Whitehall, from the Colonial Office. So these conversations begin to happen already in the 18th century. So in the aftermath of the French and Haitian revolutions, well, after the American Revolution and after the French and Haitian revolutions, a wave of what we can think of as sort of democratizing sort of popular culture sweeps the British Atlantic world, which people have talked about here. So this obviously includes the Act to Abolish the Slave Trade, and the 1832 reform of the Imperial Parliament, which throws out the figures who had sat in Parliament who were part of what is probably one of history's most powerful lobby groups. I mean, Big Oil has nothing on these people. These were the people connected to the slave trade and sugar plantations. They were called unofficially the West India Interest, and they dominated politics, foreign policy and trade policy in Britain and in France in the period of the 18th century. So a lot of them lost their seats in the reform of Parliament, which brought an abolitionist government to power, making abolition and various other reforms, which had not been possible before, possible. And the British imperial government would take an increasingly interventionist approach in the Caribbean, implementing a system of public primary education based on this massive donation to the government, which actually is the basis of modern public education in the Anglophone Caribbean. But what they also sought to do was to try to convince these old assemblies to get rid of themselves so that they could be ruled more efficiently from Whitehall. And on the one hand, this was a policy of seeking to get greater power for the Colonial Office to carry out its abolitionist agenda. But on the other hand, to be anti-slavery was not necessarily to be anti-racist. There was this concern that many of the most wealthy sugar colonies, particularly Jamaica, where planters were heavily in debt, that those economies would collapse after emancipation, that it would lead to a growing black peasant class, which would gain enough property in order to qualify for the franchise. So there was a desire to head that off in order to prevent that from happening. So over the course of the 1850s, the electorate, particularly in Jamaica, did transform, so that you had ex-slaves who were voted into the House of Assembly, also more Jews, more brown Jamaicans, more merchants, people who were not from the traditional political class. And in 1839, the imperial government attempted, and this was the first time they'd done anything quite like this since the era of the American Revolution, they attempted to impose, to sort of supersede the jurisdiction of the colonies and impose legislation on the colonies. So this is the 1839 an act to reform, basically to abolish the Jamaican House of Assembly. And it ushered in something called the Jamaican Constitutional Crisis, and it led to the fall of the British government, the government of Lord Melbourne, which only came back to power on the understanding that it would cease in its interventionist efforts in the Caribbean. It would no longer attempt to implement measures to supersede the jurisdiction of the Houses of Assembly in the Caribbean. Meanwhile, in India, in the same period, between 1757, the Battle of Plassey, which is the moment that launches sort of the modern British imperial experience in India, you had the rule of the East India Company, which is kind of the Indian equivalent of the plantocracy in the Caribbean. In fact, the term nabob was often used for both West Indian planters and for officials of the East India Company. And what emerged was this sort of gradual, particularly after the American Revolution, a growing effort to reform and shift power away from the East India Company. And so you have a struggle between the imperial government and the East India Company to gain greater control. And in both the Caribbean and in Britain, this reformist movement, one of the really important things about it, it's not a democratic movement, but it begins to imagine political participation in the empire on different kinds of terms. So that these are their policies of advancing high caste Indians, like the sepoys in the army, training Indians for the imperial civil service. There's a growing vision of a multiracial Indian civil service. And the idea that, that Britishness can come to mean something that is much more trans-imperial, much less defined, not defined by skin color and not defined by race. So this also is a victim. This vision is also a victim of the fall of the Melbourne government and the shift in the 1840s towards a form of an attitude towards imperial rule, which is much more sharply defined by understandings of racial difference. And this term, responsible government, is very closely tied to wider shifts in public attitudes and not public attitudes, certainly elite intellectual attitudes, which were current. You can see that in imperial correspondence, the assumption that race and geography should match each other, that people of certain races belong in certain parts of the world, which is in fact not an assumption in the 18th century at all, but also that certain peoples could exercise government and others could not. So that what you get over the course of the 1840s and 1850s is an increasingly crude and actually quite simplistic racist vision, which views the empire increasingly in these very simple terms, in terms of racial difference. So it's in that context that it becomes imaginable in the 1860s to eliminate some of the oldest houses of assembly, oldest elected bodies in the empire, in the Caribbean, and replace them with this authoritarian rule, to establish crown colony rule in India, and to grant quote-unquote responsible government in Canada in that same moment. So the broader lesson here is that we have to see, well, I choose to see, we don't have to, but I choose to see confederation in much broader terms. I mean, I think it is quite current. I am not a Canadian historian, but I have noticed a certain, tendency in public discourse to draw comparisons with the United States and to say that one of the things that makes Canada so different from the United States is the absence of official racial segregation, which is in fact not true. It did exist in many jurisdictions in Canada. However, certainly in terms of, federal policy, there's, one could say that, yes, no, it's not true. So basically what I would say is that view, that sort of popular view, that's a distinction, when seen against the backdrop of the empire, does not hold up. So the idea that responsible government was appropriate for Canada, eventually for Australia, even, although it's a little bit complicated, home rule for Ireland sometime later, but the idea that you can use this system, this form of politics, as a way of reconciling conflicts among people who were increasingly understood as white, and whose ethnic differences are increasingly understood to be, yes, significant, but less significant than the bigger gap between white and non-white in the empire. And that responsible government, much like the compromise that allows the sort of Old South to reassert itself through Jim Crow in the United States, that precisely that kind of compromise where whiteness trumps, that word will never feel the same, other forms of difference, and that you can resolve those conflicts by giving settlers and former slave owners control, basically, political control, and in many ways life and death control over non-white colonized subjects, and elevate them to a degree of political power that is clearly not extended to others, that is a means of reconciling political tensions amongst whites. This is the broader context for Confederation. And I think the other point, which is one, again, for our own times, is that it really does challenge. We often think, the 19th century, the civilizing mission, or whatever, part of this longer, I'm almost there, literally two lines, part of this longer history of, history as a sort of move towards ever better forms of democracy, which is completely not true. Had you lived through the era of slave emancipation, through the era of East India Company reform and Indian civil service reform, what you experienced was a profound process of democratization which was quite dramatically reversed in the 1850s and into the 1860s. And in some cases, I'm from Barbados, and in Barbados, literally 1% of the population into the 1940s would have qualified for the vote under the old system, right? So what it entrenches is a quite prolonged period of authoritarian rule. And seen from the perspective of much of the empire, what defined the British Empire was authoritarian rule that favored white settlers. And finally, I think there's also a connection between this history, the political history of the Caribbean, and the elimination of these houses of assembly in favor of authoritarian rule, and precisely the relationship between the arrival of responsible government in Canada, sort of white settler government, and the idea that white settlers would become the ones who were responsible for administering internal colonization policy, so things like the Indian Act and so on. That is also part of this sort of essentially trans-imperial racial pact of government, that the sort of rule, white minority rule, was defined by power over others. So you see something quite similar in Australia, right, with Australian Confederation. So there is a close connection then between these histories of sort of anti-black racism in the empire and policies relating to Indigenous peoples in Canada. So I think it's important to think critically about Confederation, about Canada 150, but I definitely do not think that it's appropriate to be thinking about it as a moment in the broader history of democracy. It most certainly, from the perspective of the Caribbean, is not. Thank you.
You've been listening to a recording of Melanie Newton's talk, A Tale of Two Empires, Race and Revolution in the 1860s Caribbean. The talk was delivered on April 22nd, 2017, as part of the Other 60s, a decade that shaped Canada and the world. A symposium hosted by the Department of History at the University of Toronto. You can find recordings of other talks at ActiveHistory.ca, and be sure to subscribe to the History Chats podcast feed wherever you get your podcasts.